Okay, so thank you, Sylvia. And it's time for me to bring to you Roubert's Whitaker. So a few words. Roubert's Whitaker is an American journalist and the author who has won numerous awards as journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for Medical Writing and National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. In 1998, he co-wrote a series on psychiatric research for the Boston Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover magazine as one of the best science books of 2002. Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editor's Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. After Robert's speech, we'll have Il speak, and after that time, we'll have time for a general discussion. I do want to say for those of you who are back home that you can raise questions, and we hope that during discussion time, we'll have time to take both questions from inside the room, as well as the things that you write to us from home. So please, Robert.
First of all, I just want to say it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. So thank you for having me, I guess, under such short notice. I have a lot of thanks too, but I just want to say it's really great being here back in Israel for the second time. So here's what we're going to do in the next 50 minutes. We're going to look at a little bit about the conventional narrative around psychiatry and psychiatric drugs. And then you're going to look into whether really the science supports that conventional narrative that drives our thinking and our care and that sort of thing. And then after that, we can ask ourselves the question of whether we need to rethink our care. So it's going to be three things. Look at the conventional narrative, look at some of the science behind that narrative, and then really leave you all with a question of whether there should be some rethinking. So if you look at the conventional narrative, it goes like this. In 1955, we get a new drug that arrives in asylum medicine. It's called, the chemical name is called chlorpromazine. Here in Israel, I think the brand name, it's Largactil. In the United States, it was Thorazine. And this drug is remembered today as launching a great psychopharmacological revolution, a great advance in care. And the understanding is it was this drug is remembered today as the first antipsychotic. And if you think of that word, meaning as it's an antidote to psychosis, almost like an antibiotic is an antidote to a bacterial infection. Okay, and this drug is remembered as what was making it possible to empty the asylums and care for, quote, the seriously mentally ill out in the community. And then we get, and you see what this historian says. It says, great in advance as the introduction of penicillin into infectious medicine, which means it's remembered as this great leap forward. Then we get antidepressant drugs, we get anti-anxiety drugs, and again, that means we're getting antidotes for specific psychiatric conditions. All this happens in the 60s. Then the next big development within psychiatry is the publication of this book in 1980. This is the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual published by the American Psychiatric Association. And even though it's an American product, it basically becomes the diagnostic manual around the world. We're going to use this to conceive of psychiatric disorders. Research is going to be done according to the categorization of people in this book. And this man here, Jeffrey Lieberman, was the former president of the American Psychiatric Association. He says, this is the book that changed everything, and it did. And the reason it did is it's going to reconceptualize a lot of psychiatric problems. So if you go to DSM-1 and DSM-2, if you go into that book, there's a core group of biological problems seen as biological illnesses, but the vast majority are actually seen as psychological problems. Difficulties arising out of life conditions, adjustment to life setbacks, that sort of thing. And so if you have a lot of conditions like depression and anxiety arising out of social situations, then you need to fix the social situation, right? But all this is going to be reconceptualized as diseases of the brain. So you get depressed after, for whatever reason now, that's seen as an illness with inside the head, okay? And this is a big shift. This is why Jeffrey Lieberman says this is the book that changed everything, because in essence, it's a societal reconceptualization of what drives distress, whether it be depression, anxiety, other mood disorders, etc. And you'll see here, so the book is published in 1980, and Nancy Andreasen is the former editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and she's now explaining this change in conceptualization. And you can all read it here, right? These are diseases. and they should be considered medical illnesses just as diabetes, heart disease, cancer are. And each illness, depression is different from anxiety, which is different from bipolar, which is different from psychosis, etc. They're all distinct illnesses with distinct treatments. So think about the difference. You know, a lot of you are working in social work here, right? The difference is we're going to locate problems now inside the individual's head, okay? Something's going to be wrong with that. You'll see there are many hints that mental illness is due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and treatment involves correcting those chemical imbalances. So we're locating the problem now inside the head, and not in the in-between spaces of people, not in the social spaces. This is the big switch. Now, this idea is born in the United States with this publication of DSM-3, and basically this idea now gets globalized. It gets exported around the world. And the idea is these are diseases of the brain. We have drugs that are highly effective and safe, and we're going to hear about chemical imbalances, and that psychiatric disorders are underdiagnosed and undertreated. So part of the progress since 1980 is going to get more people diagnosed and more people treated, okay? And this is going to be seen as a medical advance. And the biggest part of this story is the chemical imbalance story. So immediately after the publication of DSM-3, you'll start seeing leading American psychiatrists saying, we're discovering that, say, depression is due to too little serotonin in the brain, and that we now have drugs that can fix those problems, that chemical imbalance, like insulin for diabetes. You all heard this metaphor? That these problems are due to chemical imbalances and that we have drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, right? That is a story of extraordinary medical advance. Think about that. We've found the very molecule that causes depression, and we can fix it. We can put it right. Same with psychosis. That's seen as a problem with dopamine, and we can set that right. That's the story we begin hearing in the 80s. And all I've done here is pick some leading American psychiatrists telling this to the public. And you'll see this. Antidepressants restore the chemical imbalance scientists have linked to depressions. 2001, we now know that mental illnesses, such as depression or schizophrenia, they're not moral weaknesses, but real diseases caused by abnormalities of brain structure and imbalances of chemicals in the brain. And you can go forward with this. Psychiatry can now restore these to normal. You'll see 2014, the National Alliance on Mental Illness is a big family organization in the United States. You go on their website. Research has shown that imbalance in neurotransmitters can be corrected with antidepressants, okay? And that story was promoted around the world. And that story also becomes the vehicle for an incredible expansion in the prescribing of antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs. So for example, in 1987, in the United States, about 1% of the adult population took an antidepressant. Now it's about 12-13% take an antidepressant. In terms of spending on psychiatric drugs, we spent about, in 1987, about $800 million on psychiatric drugs. In the United States, we now spend about $40 billion a year on psychiatric drugs. So this is part of this big expansion in the use of psychiatric drugs and in the treatment of people with these diagnoses. So as you heard in the introduction, I come at this from as a journalistic background. And so one of the things from a journalistic background is when you hear a narrative or you hear a story told, now you want to start asking, is it true? Okay? If we go to the science, are we going to find out is it's true? Because you're supposed to be the intermediary between, sometimes commercial interests, scientific interests, and the public, and you want to be a faithful interpreter or a relator of information. So the first thing I did, and I began, there's many reasons why I began to challenge this narrative, but for this particular purpose, and the book Anatomy of an Epidemic, we're getting more people treated. Now normally when you make great medical advances, you're going to see the burden of that illness decrease in a society. Does that make sense? You identify the problem and you can correct it. So the first thing I looked at, and you have disability studies here, was the number of people going on disability due to mental illness during this time of progress. So in 1987 is when Prozac arrives on the market. And at this time, we had 1.25 million people on disability due to mental illness in the United States. And now we have more than 5 million people, okay? Now, there's two ways to look at this data. Some people will say, oh, this means society is getting better at helping people, okay? Other people might say, like, is something about this paradigm of care actually lending itself to more people ending up on disability, okay? And anyway, what you see is every country that has adopted this paradigm of care, rather than see disability rates due to mental disorders, psychiatric disorders, stabilize or go down, you see this remarkable increase. And it's in countries with very good social service systems as well. Good National Health Service. This is Australia. It's a 4-fold increase. New Zealand, a 4-fold increase since 1991. Whoops. This is a little bit different data. This is the number of people going on disability each year due to mental illness. So in 1999 in Denmark, a little more than 3,000 people were going on disability. Now you go to 2010 and it's like 9,000. That's a tripling of the number of people going on each year. This data is this. If you went back to 1992 in Sweden and you looked at all the people going on disability, about 18% were due to psychiatric problems. The others were like back problems, that sort of thing. Now you go forward to 2010 and about 60% are going on because of mental disorders. So what does this data mean? From my point of view, it raises a question. Okay, it doesn't prove anything. But it does raise a question about whether our diagnosis and treatment, does it actually increase the likelihood a person will do well over the long term? In other words, recover from the problems, or for some reason, does it actually increase the risk that a person will end up impaired and sort of chronically ill with the problem, okay? So it raises a question. It doesn't prove anything. So the first thing that I wanted to do, having raised that question in this book, is investigate the chemical imbalance hypothesis. Is it true? Did we discover, for example, that depression was due to too little serotonin? And when you investigate this hypothesis, here's what you find. That it arose not from an understanding of what was going on with people so diagnosed, say with depression or schizophrenia, but rather from understanding of the mechanism of action of the drugs on the brain. So, for example, antidepressants, what do they do? So, you all know how neurons communicate in the brain. You have a presynaptic neuron that releases that neurotransmitter into the tiny gap between neurons, which we call the synaptic cleft. That neurotransmitter then binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, which we call the postsynaptic neuron. And now the brain, that's how the presynaptic neuron communicates with the postsynaptic neuron. And in order to have a crisp messaging system, you now have to remove that serotonin, or whatever the neurotransmitter is, from that synaptic cleft. And it's removed in one of two ways. It either goes back into the presynaptic neuron via a reuptake channel, or an enzyme comes along and metabolizes it, and the metabolites are carted off as waste. But most goes back up into the presynaptic neuron. So they understand that the first round of antidepressants and then Prozac, what they do is they block the reuptake of serotonin or norepinephrine. And now that neurotransmitter stays longer in that synaptic cleft, so you're upping serotonergic activity, right? So people hypothesize maybe depression is due to too little serotonin. And the other part of the chemical imbalance story is related to antipsychotics. Antipsychotics block dopamine receptors, okay, so they thwart it. So the hypothesis was maybe schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine, okay? So the chemical imbalance theory arises from understanding of how the drugs act on the brain. So your next question is, do people with depression have low serotonin before they go on the drug? Okay, so now you're going to start investigating this question in unmedicated patients. This was done in the 1970s and early 1980s. The NIMH is the National Institute of Mental Health. This is our big funding agency for research into psychiatric problems. And here's what they concluded in 1984. You see what they're saying here? They're saying we're not finding problems of the serotonergic function in depressed patients. That's what they're saying here. Okay? Now, they continue to investigate the low serotonin theory for the next 15 years. If you were to read the 1999 textbook of the American Psychiatric Association. Read the textbook itself. It says the monoamine theory of depression has not panned out. It was a hypothesis that did not pan out. So the very same time that they're telling the public this, we found that this is happening, that's what's going to the public. In their own textbook, they're saying the hypothesis did not pan out. And you'll see this. Here's another textbook that's used. Essential Psychopharmacology. There is no clear and convincing evidence that serotonergic deficiency accounts for depression. That is, there is no real serotonin deficit. And just some more comments about this. Stephen Hyman is the former director of the NIMH. He writes a textbook called Molecular Psychiatry in 2002. He says, we've looked at this dopamine hyperactivity theory, and there's no compelling evidence that a lesion in the dopamine system is a primary cause of schizophrenia. Kenneth Kendler was one of the leading world investigators of the chemical imbalance theory, and he says in 2005, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations and have not found them. And here's my favorite quote. Ronald Pies is a famous American psychiatrist. He's former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, which is a publication of the American Psychiatric Association. He says, in truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. So you start to see the problem here, right? We have a public story that governs our thinking about what the problem is, the prescribing of drugs, and what patients are told about why they need to take the medications. But science is telling us we just don't know the pathology of these things. And these drugs are not fixing a known problem. Then if you keep going, though, the next question is, so if you take a drug, how does the brain respond to the drug's presence? Because the brain is this incredibly neuroplastic organ, and when you perturb a function, it's going to try to compensate for that perturbation. So you go on an SSRI. The SSRI blocks the normal reuptake of serotonin. It's acting as an accelerator, right? Serotonin stays longer in the synaptic cleft than normal. What's your brain going to do? Your brain is going to try to do the opposite reaction. Okay, so if you're accelerating serotonergic activity, your brain now is going to try to downregulate or decrease its own serotonergic activity. So the presynaptic neurons will put out less serotonin than normal. Now that compensatory adaptation seems to burn out after about a few weeks. And then the receiving neurons, what they're going to do is they're going to decrease their density of receptors for serotonin. They're going to try to become less sensitive to this molecule since it's staying in the gap longer than normal. So this is what they came to understand of how the drugs affect the brain. And in 1996, Stephen Hyman put this together. He says, what psychiatric drugs do, they create perturbations in neurotransmitter functions. They block some normal process. In response to this, the brain goes through these compensatory adaptations, trying to maintain what they call a homeostatic equilibrium, the normal functioning of those systems. And then he says, by the time you're done, the brain is now functioning in a manner that is, quote, qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from the normal state. So within the public sphere, we are told of drugs that fix a pathology, fix an abnormality, and normalize things. What science is telling us is we don't know the problem. Now you take a drug that perturbs normal functioning, and now your brain actually ends up functioning in an abnormal manner. And the real irony of this is this. So depression, for example, was hypothesized to be due to low serotonin, right? Now they research people who are depressed before they go on an antidepressant, and we don't find a pathology in the serotonergic function. But then if you go on the drug, you end up with the very pathology hypothesized to cause the problem in the first place. You end up actually with the serotonergic system that's in a depressed state, so to speak. And this happens with all the drugs. It's called, researchers will say, they induce an oppositional tolerance, the opposite effect of what is originally intended by the drug itself, okay? So going forward here, what you're hearing now is a scientific narrative that is out of sync with the public narrative. And now the next question we've got to ask ourselves is, what is the effect of these drugs over the long term? And one of the reasons that anatomy of an epidemic got a lot of attention is because as we normally assess the merits of drugs and psychiatric drugs, we assess their merits over a short period of time, like 6 weeks. So do they knock down the symptoms of psychosis or the symptoms of depression better than placebo over the short term, right? And if they do that, they're seen as effective and they get put on the market. What I wanted to ask in this book was, okay, but how do they affect people over 1 year, 2.5 years, 5 years, over the long term, because many people take these drugs over the long term? That's a new question. And I was going to see, what does science say? And really, honestly, the reason the book has gotten the attention it has is because it really hadn't been looked at closely. I know that seems odd, but it really had not. And in addition, for this long-term effect, it's not just how it affects symptoms, the target symptom, but how about the ability to function in life, to work, to socialize, to enjoy life, and physical health, that sort of thing as well. So this is the next step in this look. This just goes to what I was talking about, the development of oppositional tolerance in effect with antipsychotics. They block dopamine receptors, so what your brain does is increase dopamine receptors. I've already explained this. And then let's just look at the first one. How do psychiatric medications affect the long-term course of mental disorders? So the first thing you want to do, put yourself in my shoes right now. First of all, you want to find out, well, what is the evidence base for the use of the drugs, right? Because if you have a psychiatrist here, they will say there's an evidence base for both short-term and long-term. And the short-term is the studies I just said. You randomize people into placebo or drug, and generally over 6 weeks, the drug-treated group, both for antidepressants or antipsychotics, has a little greater reduction of symptoms, so those seen are effective, okay? Long-term, it comes from this, and these studies go back to the 60s. You get a group of people, say, diagnosed with schizophrenia, stabilized on antipsychotics, okay? And then you randomize half to drug withdrawal and half to drug maintenance, and with great regularity, this group randomized to drug withdrawal relapses at a higher rate, okay? So what researchers said, see, you take away the drug and the disease returns. That's why we have to keep people on these drugs long-term, all right? And that's the long-term evidence still cited in psychiatric textbooks. But what's the problem with that evidence base? There's a couple problems. One, this group that's withdrawn, are you seeing withdrawal symptoms or are you seeing return of illness? Because the brain has adjusted to the presence of the drug. Now you take away the drug, and we know that you're going to have some withdrawal symptoms. So what are you seeing? Are you seeing withdrawal symptoms or are you seeing return of the illness? There's some confusion there. And the second thing is this. The withdrawal studies tell you if you're stabilized on the drug, at least coming off abruptly, most of those are abrupt withdrawal studies, it's really dangerous, okay? You're at high risk of relapse. But they don't tell you how people are functioning 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, right? What they're really telling you is there's a lot of risk of coming off, especially abruptly. So again, you're the journalist now, right? Your next step is, well, is there other kinds of evidence that show that these drugs are improving long-term outcomes? And if you do that, whether you do it for antidepressants or antipsychotics, you'll get these admissions in the scientific literature. We don't have evidence that antidepressants are improving long-term outcomes. We do not have evidence that antipsychotics are improving long-term outcomes. And you'll see this by Emanuel Stipp. He says, can we answer this question in 2002, 50 years of using these drugs? Are these drugs effective in treating schizophrenia long-term? He says, we just don't have the evidence. And now read the bottom part. Just read the bottom part. This is the risk you're taking by inviting me here. Okay? Because you may find things in the literature that counters everything you know to be true. That's what he's saying. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go down and back, and we're going to see if in this scientific literature we can see, is there some evidence about how antipsychotics shape long-term outcomes, okay? Now the first thing you want to do, if you're going to answer this question of how a drug affects long-term outcomes, you're going to try to figure out what sort of outcomes were you getting spectrum of outcomes before you used the drug, before the drug came on the market. And here's the first surprise. If you go back to studies done in 1945 to 55, the decade before the introduction of chlorpromazine, you think you're going to find that people didn't get better, because that's the common memory. What you actually find in the data is about 2/3 of patients hospitalized for a first episode of psychosis would be discharged within 12 to 18 months. And now if you followed 100 patients that were hospitalized and you came back 5 years later, somewhere between 67 and 70 to 75% would be working and out in the society. This is before we had the antipsychotics. Now what that means is there is about 30% that stays in the hospital and becomes part of a growing chronic population. But we have forgotten that many people actually just recovered from a psychotic episode and they had a time of psychosis and then they went back into society, okay? Now the very first follow-up study was done in the 1960s. This is still a famous study. People come into a hospital, they're randomized either to drug or to placebo. At 6 weeks, the drug-treated patients are doing better. Then they're all discharged. They look a year later and they notice something odd. The 3 groups that were treated with drug, there were 4 groups, 3 with different neuroleptics, 1 with placebo. Every group treated with antipsychotic had higher rehospitalization rates at the end of 1 year. So at the very beginning of this history of science, what are you seeing? A possible paradox. Drugs that are effective over the short term may be increasing the chronicity over the long term. That's the biggest hint in this. So then someone did a retrospective study. He said, well, what are the outcomes we used to get? 5-year outcomes. And then he compares them to a group diagnosed in 67 but treated with drugs. And look at the difference. In 1947, 76% of that cohort were successfully living in the community at the end of 5 years. So they're not on disability, okay? They're working, they're out in the community. Now in the modern group, in the medicated area, they're much more socially dependent. They're much more likely to be not working, that sort of thing, than the 47 cohort. And what he concludes is, if we're interested in long-term outcomes, we may need to rethink this. So then in the 1970s, the NIMH funds 3 trials that is meant to revisit this question. How are we affecting long-term outcomes of people diagnosed with the first episode of psychosis? Each one was randomized, and the way the randomized studies were basically done with this. Half people would get conventional care, the other half would get psychosocial care, and maybe some selective use of antipsychotics. They would withhold antipsychotics right away and just wait to see who needed them. Each time the experimental group had better long-term outcomes, okay? And then you get the big question that still hovers over this whole enterprise. So one of the men who did the study is named William Carpenter. He's still a famous researcher in the United States on schizophrenia. He says this: we know that once you're on these drugs, antipsychotics, you're at greater risk of relapse than if you're at greater risk of relapse if you come off the drugs than if you're maintained. That's the relapse studies. But then he says, but then he has these other literature that shows higher relapse rates for the medicated patients right from the beginning. So he raises the question, but what if these patients had never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raise the possibility that antipsychotic medication may make some patients more vulnerable to future relapse than would be the case in the normal course of the illness. You see why this is so profound? What he's worried here is that the drugs induce a biological change that over time make you more vulnerable to the very symptom you're trying to treat, which is psychosis, okay? And that is this moment of, oh God moment in psychiatry, because if this is true, if the evidence is pointing to something, you may be making people more chronically ill over the long term, okay? Then what happens after that? You get researchers from McGill University that say, we think we know what's happening. What happens is you go on antipsychotics, they block your dopamine receptors. This causes an increase in dopamine receptors. And now, so you have the accelerator down on dopamine, you take away the drug, and that's why you're at such increased risk of psychotic symptoms returning. It's because your brain has been changed in this way. And they say, it's not just that you're at more risk of relapse, but more severe relapses, okay? So this is what happens in the scientific literature by the early 80s. There's this worry that the drugs induce a change that has this paradoxical long-term effect. But now we're in 2018, and you can look at other research and see, is that worry confirmed, or has that worry been put to rest? And what you're going to try to do now is you're going to try to look at every type of evidence you can find, okay? And we could spend a couple hours on this. We'll see if we can do it in the next 10 minutes. So the first thing I looked at is cross-cultural studies. These were studies done by the World Health Organization, in which they did 2 studies, one 2 years in length, one 5 years in length. People were diagnosed with schizophrenia by Western standards, and it compared outcomes in 3 developing countries: India, Nigeria, and Colombia, with outcomes in the US and 6 rich countries. Each time they found outcomes were better in the poor countries. By the way, this was the study that got me interested in the whole subject. And it was this conclusion. They concluded that, quote, being in a developed country was a strong predictor of not attaining a complete remission. And I wanted to know why, living in a developed Western country with our advanced medical care, would that be a predictor you're going to have a poor outcome? Now, one of the things they did in this study is when they were shocked by the first outcomes, and they hypothesized, well, maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is the patients are more medication compliant. So they take their antipsychotics more regularly. So they measured antipsychotic usage in the second study, and here's what they found. In the poor countries, they used the drugs acutely but not chronically. In other words, short-term for the episode, but they did not maintain the patients on the drugs. Only 16%, whereas in the US and other countries, that was the standard of care. So at least in these studies, cross-cultural, see better outcomes where the drugs are by and large used short-term, not long-term. The next, real quickly, we get MRI technology in the 1990s. One of the thoughts is that is raised by Nancy Andreasen, that schizophrenia is it's a progressive brain disease characterized by brain volume loss over time. So she measures volumes and she says that's what you get. Over time, you get this loss in brain volume in schizophrenia patients. Then she says as you get this shrinkage in the brain, this is associated with the worsening of negative symptoms, increased functional impairment, and cognitive decline. And she's saying here, the problem is the drugs don't arrest, they don't stop this disease process. That's what she's saying. But then someone does a study in macaque monkeys. He does a study where he gives one group antipsychotics, the other group not antipsychotics, at a dosage that's appropriate for the monkeys. He sacrifices them out at 27 months, and he finds that the monkeys that were given antipsychotics, either the old ones or the new ones, their brains now weigh about 10% less. So that shows it's not due to the disease. And then that makes Andreasen go back to her own literature, and she concludes it's drug-related, not disease-related. So all of a sudden now you have this image. Drug you take causes a morphological change in the brain. That morphological change is associated with a worsening of symptoms, which is really is an image of drugs that over the long term cause an iatrogenic effect. That's what you get from the MRI images. By the way, we're talking about outcomes in the aggregate here, right? We know that people have different responses. And then we get the best long-term study done in modern time. It's done by Martin Harrow at the University of Illinois. It's a naturalistic study. He gets 200 people, newly psychotic patients, coming into 2 area hospitals, one public, one private. And everybody's going to be treated with medications. Then they're going to be discharged, and he's just going to follow them 2, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, 20 years. He's going to look at how they're doing at each follow-up. Are they psychotic? Are they working? Are they functioning? And what's their medication use? Here's his hypothesis. The people who stop taking their drugs are going to be doing terribly. He expects his study to confirm the conventional narrative, all right? You can go read it. That's his hypothesis. But he finds something stunningly different. So at the end of 2 years, among the schizophrenia patients, there's 64 schizophrenia patients that he keeps in his study for 15 years and 81 with mild or psychotic disorders, okay? You see at 2 years, so 25 of the 64 are off antipsychotics. Both groups are anxious, right? Those on meds and those off meds. But what happens between year 2 and 4.5? What do you see? What happens to the anxiety symptoms of the group off drug? This is where you're seeing healing going on that you don't see anywhere else in the literature. Because those relapse studies are telling you what happens like 6 weeks, 9 weeks after you withdraw the drug. This is actually a very optimistic slide. It's showing a natural healing process that we don't see. Cognitive function is better for the off-medicated group at each time. They're much more likely to be working. By the way, if the group that stopped taking medication, they disappeared from psychiatry. Because you're not allowed really not to take your medications and stay in treatment, at least at that time. They left. They were not on disability, and about 87% returned to work, something like that. Here's the biggest surprise. If you'll see, if I had a chart looking at psychotic symptoms at 2 years, both groups were psychotic. But what happened was between year 2 and 4.5, the off-med group actually had a greater reduction in psychotic symptoms than the medicated group. And you'll see, at 10 years, 80% of those on meds are psychotic versus 23% off. So why would that be? Well, what Martin Harrow says is, I think the problem is that dopamine supersensitivity we talked about, that induced change in the brain. This is recovery rates. Recovered, you had to be asymptomatic, working or back in school, okay? And it was 8 times higher for the off-med group. So here's what the researcher concluded from the best longitudinal study we have. Just read what he said. And again, so as a journalist, my job or my hope is just to have a more informed public. And you, if you're involved in social work, etc., and you're trying to organize your care, you really want to know what the evidence is from all these different types of evidence. At least that's my feeling. And that this should have been known, but of course this finding doesn't get promoted. Anyway, remember he has milder disorders as well. Just look at this chart, and then we'll move on to antidepressants. So he has schizophrenia on meds, right? So he ends up with 4 groups. Schizophrenia on meds, schizophrenia off meds, milder disorders on, milder disorders off. Okay? So the group that's doing worse in global functioning at 15 years is schizophrenia on meds. The next worst is milder disorders on meds. So here's the kicker. This group, schizophrenia, were seen as more severely ill, okay, early in the course. They had a worse prognosis. So why is schizophrenia off doing better than milder disorders on? At the very least, that's a question to ask, right? Oh, sorry. Not supposed to stray from here. Anyway, you can see that at the very least it asks a question. I'm going to skip past this just so we can get real quickly into the antidepressants. When Harrow's study came out in 2008, people said, this can't be, there's got to be a problem, it's just a naturalistic study, we need other types of studies. We've now got like 6 or 7 long-term studies, and in each case, you see higher recovery rates for those who end up off medication, whether through randomization or naturalistic studies. This was a randomized study done in the Netherlands. Those randomized to drug reduction and discontinuation at 7 years, they were twice as likely to be recovered. This is just symptom remission by drug use. You'll see much more full recovery in the off-med group. This was a Denmark study. 300 first episode patients, 121 who stopped taking their drugs. You'll see it's the group off meds. By the way, same baseline characteristics. It's not that there was a group that was less ill here. Okay, it's just for whatever reason one group stopped taking meds. You'll see more likely to be employed, more likely to be in remission. There's studies now that have been done in Germany, Australia, UK, Finland, and Norway. And every study has found On the whole, in aggregates, the unmedicated group is more likely to be in recovery and working. And again, these are aggregate outcomes. They're not, you know, so within aggregate outcomes, you have some poor, you have some okay, and you have some good. Just read this. So this is coming from the British Journal of Psychiatry. So this is coming from the heart of psychiatry. And that last phrase is a British phrase. The drugs, put simply, not worth the candle, means maybe they're causing more harm than good. Now, the brilliant part of this story is this. And by the way, our head guy for the NIMH said the same thing. We have to ask ourselves, do these drugs actually worsen long-term outcomes? The beauty of this story is this. There is a group in northern Finland that in 1992 rethought their use of antipsychotics and reconceptualized psychosis. So it's called open dialogue therapy in northern Finland. And they said this: psychosis doesn't reside in the head of the individual, but in the in-between spaces of people. And they say the psychotic person bears the burden of making known this disruption in these social spaces. So they have to fix the social spaces. So they actually treat the social group, okay? Intensive psychosocial care right from the beginning. In terms of antipsychotics, here's what they do. They do not initially put people on antipsychotics. The thought is there will be a percentage of people that can get better without going on the drugs, so you don't get this brain change. There'll be a second group that needs the drugs for a period of time but then can come off successfully. And there'll be a third group actually that needs the medications long term. So if you had someone here from Open Dialogue, they would say, this is a best drug use model. This isn't an anti-drug use model. We're using the drugs and figuring out for whom and for how long, okay? Anyway, they began doing this in 1992, and they have now by far the best outcomes in the Western world. And here's their outcomes at the end of 5 years. 80 to 85% of their people are working or back in school and asymptomatic. In other words, they had a time of psychosis, but they did not become chronically ill. And in terms of medication use, 67% have never been put on antipsychotics. Go back to that William Carpenter comment. If we can get people through without putting them on, you don't get this biological change in people. And another 13% have used the drugs temporarily and 20% long term. So that's how they've developed a selective use model. And increasingly, you'll see in some circles an adoption of this idea based around two principles. Can we get people through their first episode without going on the medication? Because there'll be some percentage that can do that. And second of all, once people are on, there's some percentage of people that can come off. Not everyone, but can come off, so we need to have tapering protocols as well. Now, you all know you have a big Soteria experiment here, right? A big Soteria program going here. Remember when I talked about 3 experiments done in the 1970s? One was the original Soteria house. So in the original Soteria house, what happens, they took people coming into hospital, half were randomized to care in the Soteria, which was a house staffed, must be tired, staffed by ordinary people, and the other group got conventional care in the hospital. And what they found were 2 things. And in this Soteria house, they did not immediately use antipsychotics. It was a selective use model. The group at the end of 6 weeks had just as good outcomes as the regular care. And at the end of 2 years, they had lower psychopathology and much more likely to be working in school. And here was the medication use in that original Soteria model. 40% never went on the drugs, 40% used them temporarily, and 20% ended up on them chronically. So you actually see in the history this value of a selective use model that goes way back to the 70s. And in a way, here now in your Soteria model, you're sort of revisiting this promise that happened a long, long time ago. So real quickly, because I got about 10 minutes, right? Why don't I just talk through the rest? So that's the story in antipsychotics, okay? And if there's any class of drugs where you should see the benefit outweighing the risk, it's with the antipsychotics. Because this is severe mental illness, quote, severe mental illness, and it's just understood in society people need to be on these medications. Or at least that was the understanding for the longest period of time. Antidepressants is a little different because even the evidence over the short term for their efficacy is much more questionable compared to antipsychotics. So anyway, if you start looking at the history of depression, here's what you find. If you go back to hospitalized patients, these are people with severe depression before the antidepressant era, and you chart their long-term outcomes. First of all, 85% would recover in the hospital and be discharged. But it would be like sometimes 12 months to 15 months before you hit that 85% discharge rate. So actually when antidepressants were first introduced, the idea was we can speed up this natural healing process. Because that's a long time to remain depressed, right? The thought was you'll get better, now we can speed it up. And if you followed 100 people hospitalized for a first episode of depression before antidepressants, you'd find 85% would get discharged at this time. And then if you followed them up for 15 years, you'd find that 50% never came back to the hospital. There'd be maybe 30% which would have a second time of hospitalization, a second episode, and only 20% would have sort of chronic episodes. So the understanding was at this time was this. It's not a chronic illness. It's an episodic disorder, okay? Comes and goes. That was the wisdom gained from epidemiological studies. Then we start giving people antidepressants, and if you go back to the time, here's what clinicians who are used to seeing the natural course of depression say about their patients. It looks like my patients are getting better faster now, but they're now relapsing more quickly back into depression. So are we causing a chronification of the disease? So you can read this here. And this happens almost immediately after antidepressants get introduced. Someone tests this in 1973, and he says, yeah, if I compare my patients treated with an antidepressant to those treated without, this group has more relapses. So it looks like we're chronifying the disease. Then you do some epidemiological studies, and by the 1980s they say, yeah, depression is running a much more chronic course than it used to. And you'll see here they're saying, they're acknowledging that our understanding of the course of depression has changed if you read this. But they're not blaming the drug here. They're saying we have new epidemiological, better epidemiological research, and we're finally discovering that it runs a chronic course. But this is the course it's now running in medicated depression. Anyway, this leads to the very same question you have with the antipsychotics. Are these drugs, in essence, do they increase the risk of people becoming chronically depressed over the long term? Then you go into studies designed to look at this. This largest antidepressant trial ever conducted. 4,041 patients entered the trial. And this was done where if you didn't respond to the first antidepressant, you could try a second, and then a third, and then a fourth. At the end of 1 year, there were only 108 people who were well and still in the trial. It's a documented stay well rate of 3%. This is just a Netherlands study. You'll see like more episodes in the drug-treated group. 5-year study in Canada. You'll see those who decided to take antidepressants or spent more time depressed in the next 5 years. This is a screening study. What this was done was this. It was meant to show the value of screening for depression. So World Health Organization investigators went into 15 cities around the world. They looked at, they went into GP clinics, and the investigators identified who was depressed but didn't say anything to the treating doctors. And the thought was, the hypothesis, if the GPs identify the depression and treat it, that will lead to better outcomes. And what they found was that diagnosis plus treatment increased the risk that a person would be depressed at the end of 1 year. So 50% of those diagnosed and treated with antidepressants were depressed at the end of 1 year. In terms of those diagnosed and not treated with an antidepressant, and you go back to their baseline scores, they're basically the same. Only 25% were depressed at the end of 1 year. And here's the kicker. If you actually follow these people at the course of 1 year, At the end of 3 months, the diagnosed drug-treated group has improved more than the diagnosed untreated group, okay? So if you stop that study at 3 months, the medicated patients have gotten better. But then what happens is the unmedicated group continues to get better, whereas the medicated group does not. It stops. So what you see in this study is efficacy that begins to peter out after about 90 days. This is just a look at disability rates between treated and untreated, and the risk of being on disability in this thing with treatment was 7 times higher. And by the way, there was not a difference in baseline severity. And just this is the last slide. This is from one of the leading mood disorder psychiatrists in the country. He used to work for Eli Lilly. So this is not a critic. This is a person who worked for the very firm that gave us Prozac. Just read it and see if you can make sense of this.
Can you summarize it in a couple of sentences
Yeah.
for those who can?
Yeah. So what he's saying is this. He's saying that over time, these drugs seem to cause a change in the brain, right? That's going to make you more sort of chronically depressed. That's what he's saying. And he's saying that if you read some of his other writings is this. You stay on the drug, you're initially relieved by it, but over time, because of these changes in the brain, you're going to become sort of chronically dysphoric. And it's not really depression. It's more like I don't give a damn about anything. Okay? I don't care about anything. And then if you look at his other research, he says this. We have 2 problems. When people come off, it may lead to severe relapses, okay? And protracted withdrawal symptoms. And he even says this. In some cases, because of this change in the brain, you're not going to be able to cope off the drug and you're going to have to go back on the drug. Okay? And yet you go back on the drug, you're going to have chronic depression. So, I told you in the beginning of this talk, it's a comparison of 2 narratives. There's one narrative that tells of medical advances, learning about the pathology of these disorders, and that says the more we can get people treated, the better we'll be. Okay? The story of science is much more complicated. And it basically is we don't know the biology of these. These drugs perturb normal function. And at the very least, you see people worrying that because of this oppositional tolerance, the fact that they induce changes the opposite of what is originally intended, that may lead to an increasing chronicity of the disorder. In other words, people are more likely still to have symptoms 5 and 10 years later, and increased risk of being on disability. That's the worry that comes from the scientific narrative. And one final thing here. You're a doctor. People come to you with some condition, whatever the condition may be. You have 50% of people who are cured. Okay? The symptoms go away, they're great. The other 50% stays the same. No one gets worse. All right? So what do you say about your treatment? Does your treatment work? 50% are cured, no one got worse. So you say, I guarantee you, if you're the doctor, you say, my treatment's good. Cures 50% of the people. But when you talk about increasing the risk of chronicity, you've got to know what the natural recovery rates are. Okay? So maybe from that particular disorder, the natural recovery rate is 70%, and 30% stay the same. And with your treatment, now you're knocking down recovery to 50%. So your treatment actually is increasing the risk of chronicity. So the reason I say this is, whenever I give this talk, people go, I know people are doing great on meds. That can be true. Okay? You're talking about how you shift the spectrum of outcomes over the long term, which begins with the foil of what is the chance of recovering in nature. And the good news part of this is you see a lot of recovery in nature from psychiatric problems, especially if you can give psychosocial support, which is what we saw with open dialogue in northern Finland. 80% of their patients basically have a time of psychosis now, and they don't become chronic patients. So anyway, thank you.
So, thank you, first of all. And as I said before, we'll have a larger discussion at the end, but I do want to take a couple of minutes if there are questions, clarification questions and things like that that we want to take. We'll also take a question or two from folks back home.
First, I just wanted to mention the interesting fact about Lapland is that the reason that they started doing this alternative kind of is because they had such a high rate of schizophrenia, the highest rate I think in Europe or something, and then they decided that they're going to fix it and try to do something with it. Other than that, I just have a question regarding, it was a little bit hard to follow what you heard about the antidepressants. I guess you were in a hurry. You talked about first episode, treatment for first episode. There's like a difference between the episodic and the chronic, and I was very confused about whether the studies were done only for the clinical depression, or were they done for the episodic, and I just didn't understand.
Sure.
Just a moment. We can only short questions because you don't have mic and it's hard to hear.
Okay.
So that's a great question. Okay, and first of all, you're absolutely right about the Western Lapland. They used to have, it's a population of 70,000, and before they instituted this form of care, they were getting 27 new cases of schizophrenia a year, which is a lot of new cases for that population. Now, the eruption of psychotic episodes hasn't really decreased that much in Western Lapland, but they're now down to about 3 schizophrenia cases a year. And the reason is people are not remaining psychotic long enough to move from the diagnosis of an episode of psychosis to schizophrenia. And the diagnosis is made if you're psychotic for six months or longer. So what they're seeing is with their treatment is they're shortening the psychotic time so much that people aren't going on to being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, your question. If we go back to that beginning thing, you want to do, it's in hospitalized patients, okay? When I talked about what we saw in depression prior to the use of antidepressants. Those epidemiological studies are in hospitalized patients, and they want to get first episode patients, in other words, first hospitalization, in order to see the spectrum of outcomes, okay? So that's where the baseline happens. Then, if you really follow the, and I did rush through it, I'm sorry, I wanted to make sure I got done. The next bit of evidence is what did clinicians see in their patients, because once they start using the antidepressants and they start noticing that the episodes now start to be seeing, people would recover, but they'd have a second episode, if we go back to that, when they first come to the doctor, more quickly than they used to. So in other words, the episodes, if they're having more than one episode, seem to be getting closer together. And that's where they're talking about the chronification. Now, if you go forward to that, with these other studies, whether it might be the US study or the Canadian study, so many of these are not in first episode. They're just basically whoever gets enrolled into the study. So in some instances, in fact, like the STAR-D study, that one where there was only 108 patients well out of the 4,041, that's almost entirely in a group that has been treated before. It's not a first episode group. So you are getting to a question of, do we have studies today that are actually focused more on people who are already in a chronic condition? And I don't have a good answer for that. And what you really want to do when you assess the merits of a treatment is you want to go back all the way to first episode and try to say, okay, what are the spectrum of outcomes we used to see with this group of people? And now what spectrum of outcomes do we get over the long term with treatments? And I will say that it's incomplete because so much of our modern studies are people who are already been in treatment like 5 years before they're now in the study.
I'm going to take one more. I'll take one more question from folks home that also want to answer, and we'll leave time at the end for questions. So keep the questions you have. We'll come back to that. But just to bring a question from back home, Judith on our webinar is asking, is there any solution for patients that have been using antidepressants for a long time and wish to stop the medication in order not to relapse?
So last night there was a meeting that I attended, Gotti was there, Ruthie was there, and about setting up a local group here in Israel that would address this very question. How do we withdraw people? What sort of support do you need? And how do you do it successfully? Because right now what happens is people so often are just left to their own, designs. Someone says, I don't want to do it, and then, they try to figure it out, house fast, that sort of thing. What there does seem to be is emerging knowledge about figuring out how to do it gradually, and also not just removing the medication, but what do you need in terms of wellness things in place. In other words, you start coming off the medication, should you be changing your diet? How about exercise? How about socialization? So the idea is that you don't just take away the medication, but you figure out what are the things to promote wellness in your life even as you take away the medication. And the idea, one of the things with this group will be to provide information to the public on this, and also to learn about it, and to really incorporate this possibility into standard of care, and that you don't have to go outside care in order to get the support.